This is the Late Round Podcast with your host, JJ Zachariason.
What's up, everyone? It's JJ Zachariason, and this is episode 722 of the Late Round Fantasy Football Podcast, sponsored by FanDuel. Thanks for tuning in. Week 13 was better for this sleeper show than Week 12 was, but it wasn't hard to be better than Week 12. On the plus side, Jared Goff and Mike White, they were reasonable streamers. Bam Knight had a nice game. Corey Davis had 85 yards, DJ Chark had 98, Nico Collins scored, and so did Evan Ingram. And the defensive streamers were really solid. On the other end, Cam Akers was the play over Kyren Williams. Jordan Mason was the play over Ty Davis-Price. Zay Jones didn't take advantage of a good matchup, Mac Hollins wasn't great, and neither was DeAndre Carter. And a lot of the deeper plays, they just didn't pan out. I'd say it was a below average week in Week 13. But there were at least some hits there. Let's move on to Week 14. Before getting the sleepers this week, I want to let you know that with only a handful of Monday Night Football games remaining this season, FanDuel and Visa are coming together to make sure the excitement surrounding Monday nights is at an all-time high. Introducing Monday Night Perfect Picks presented by Visa, a free-to-play contest on FanDuel that gives you a chance to win a share of $10,000 in cash prizes, courtesy of Visa. Here's how it works. You'll be presented with 10 questions centered around on-field action for Monday night's NFL game. Fans who answer the most questions correctly will win their share of the $10,000 prize pool. It's that easy. The contest is now live, so head to FanDuel.com/free/contest/Visa Perfect Picks and make your picks before Monday night. That's FanDuel.com/free/contest/Visa Perfect Picks. No purchase necessary. Age and location restrictions apply. Void where prohibited. See full terms at FanDuel.com. Visa and its financial institutions have not sponsored or offered this promotion in any way. As is the case each week, we'll start this week off by looking at players rostered in 10 to 50% of Yahoo leagues who you might be able to start this week. We'll start with the quarterback I talked about on the 15 transactions episode, and that's Ryan Tannehill. Treylon Burks likely not playing does hurt Tannehill this week. And if Trevor Lawrence can't go, I'd be even more concerned because there'd be less back and forth in that game. So monitor all of that. If we assume Lawrence goes and Burks doesn't, then I think Tannehill's fine. It's a tough week for quarterback streamers. So me saying that Tannehill's a streamer, I don't have a lot of excitement saying that. Because trust me, I know how bad he's been in fantasy. He scored 16 fantasy points per game over his last 4. That's nothing to write home about. But he's also faced bottom 10 matchups in each one of those games, at least by adjusted fantasy points allowed. Jacksonville's a top 10 matchup. And in the only other top 10 matchup that Tannehill's faced this year, he scored a respectable 19 fantasy points. Tennessee has a decent 23-point implied team total, so like I said, I think he's fine. I have some concerns about Tyler Huntley. As I said on the 10 Trends episode, he averaged 16 points per game last year when he threw the ball 30 or more times in a game. But he also exceeded that 16 mark just once. He had one game that really lifted that average. And on an expected points added per dropback basis, he was really inefficient. But with it being a rough week for quarterback streamers, I can definitely understand going in this direction. The Ravens do have a super ugly implied team total under 17 points, according to FanDuel Sportsbook. So from a process standpoint, it's pretty bad for Huntley. But the rushing component could be there. In relief last week against Denver, Huntley ran the ball 10 times for 41 yards. He found the end zone on the ground too. Sometimes that's all it takes. So if he's hitting double-digit rushes, there's a chance that he has a good fantasy outing. And then the last quarterback streamer this week, it's another iffy one. It's Mac Jones. Jones gets Arizona. Quarterbacks against the Cardinals this year have scored about 3.6 more points per game than their season-long average. So with Mac Jones at 12 or 13 points per game, maybe he gets over that 15-point mark. That's really all I can say about Jones. He scored more than 16 fantasy points just once this season. So chances are you're praying that variance is on your side with this one. I'd rather go with Tannehill or Huntley. Let's move on to running back and go with James Cook. He's still under that 50% mark despite playing a season-high 43% snap share last week. He ended up seeing 48% of Buffalo's running back rushes and a really solid 18% target share. His target shares over his last 2 games have been 12.8% and 18.2%. Those are very good numbers. The Jets have been a tough opponent for quarterbacks and wide receivers in fantasy, but against running backs, they've been totally average. James Cook makes plenty of sense in this matchup where the Bills are big favorites. The last time we saw the Panthers, they took a ground and pound approach against the Broncos. I'd expect them to try to do the same thing this week against Seattle, though it may be a little bit more difficult because the Seahawks offense is better than Denver's offense. Who would have thought that I would be saying that at the beginning of the season? But Chuba Hubbard had a 42% running back rush share in Week 12. He carried the ball 17 times. In their Week 11 game, he had a 27% running back rush share and a 10% target share. Both of those backfield shares, they're pretty gross. That's if you compare those shares to some of the studs in the league. But they're not that gross when you're comparing them to other players who are sitting on your waiver wire right now. It's likely going to be D'Onta Foreman getting the most work in that backfield this week. But he's also banged up. He didn't practice on Wednesday. The Seahawks are also somewhat of a run funnel. They rank as the second best matchup for running backs in adjusted fantasy points allowed, and they've seen the 5th lowest pass rate against them this season. I'm expecting a lot of runs unless this game just gets totally out of hand. That's possible, but according to FanDuel Sportsbook, the Seahawks are just 3.5-point favorites. And speaking of the Seahawks, I don't have a ton of information on that backfield to share with you at the time of this recording. But whoever is healthiest in that backfield could make some noise this week, assuming Kenneth Walker's out. The Seahawks are favorites. They're at home, and Carolina has been the 6th best matchup for opposing defenses in adjusted fantasy points allowed. So keep an eye on that injury report. Let's shift to wide receiver now and look at Robert Woods. He ended up with a 20% target share last week with Treylon Burks leaving early. And while he didn't do that much with his 5 targets, it's still an okay share in that offense. He was facing a much tougher defense last week against Philadelphia than he's going to this week against Jacksonville. Woods has actually averaged a target share per game of 23% since week 1. The Titans just aren't a very pass-heavy team. And like I said with Tannehill, they haven't faced the easiest schedule. In fact, their wide receivers have seen the 6th toughest schedule by adjusted fantasy points allowed this season. Jacksonville is a much better opponent. They rank 4th easiest in adjusted points allowed. Again, I really hope Trevor Lawrence plays to make this game more competitive, but for right now, Robert Woods is a sleeper this week. DJ Chark, though, is probably my favorite sleeper this week. And by sleeper, I'm just saying a dude who's on the waiver wire in 75% of leagues. There's a chance we see more Jameson Williams this week against Minnesota than we did last week. But Chark has now seen a 14% target share or better in 3 of his last 4. And he gets the Vikings. This is the same matchup that I called out last week with Corey Davis. The Vikings are one of the worst in the league at covering perimeter wide receivers, and Chark is a perimeter wide receiver. Minnesota is the 3rd best matchup for wide receivers in adjusted fantasy points allowed. This game has an attractive over-under. I'm very into this game, and I'm very into DJ Chark. Nico Collins is still rostered in fewer than 50% of Yahoo leagues. He's getting another shout this week. Houston's going back to Davis Mills, which is probably a good thing for their pass catchers. And Collins is seeing a ton of looks in that offense. He's averaged a target share per game of 25% over his last 4. That's resulted in 10, 7, 9, and 10 targets. This matchup against Dallas is definitely not a good one. And Houston's implied team total is absolutely laughable. But a negative game script might not be a bad thing for Collins. More passing will give him a better floor. I kind of don't mind Isaiah McKenzie this week. The Jets are the absolute toughest matchup for wide receivers according to adjusted fantasy points allowed. But they've also seen the 5th highest percentage of wide receiver targets go to the slot this season. They've still been relatively good against the slot in total, but if we're assuming that Josh Allen is able to throw for a good number of passing yards, at least compared to what the Jets have faced this year, then his wideouts can still be productive. McKenzie has target shares of 26% and 15% over his last 2. He's totaled 15 targets. So I wouldn't be surprised if he sees 6 to 8 looks in this game. Matt Collins had a rough one last week, but the peripherals were at least there. He saw a third of the Raiders' targets. He caught 5 of 9 targets for 35 yards. That kind of usage is going to get some love on this show. He's a high floor option against the Rams, at least when compared to other sleepers. And in that same game is Van Jefferson. The Rams are 6.5-point home underdogs against the Raiders, according to FanDuel Sportsbook, and the over-under in that game, according to FanDuel Sportsbook, is 44.5. That's not a horrible over-under. The Rams could be facing a negative game script. That would increase their passing volume. They didn't really see that this past week. That resulted in their lowest pass rate of the year. But Van's target shares have not been bad over his last 5. 19%, 8%. Okay, that one's not good. 19% again, 29% and 16%. He's averaging about 5 targets per game during this stretch. And the Raiders are a top 10 matchup for wide receivers. So Jefferson's in play. Tight end is actually kind of fun this week. I've got 2 of them in this tier, and there's more in the next tier. I'll get to that in a second. The first is Evan Ingram. He had a nice game last week with that touchdown. More importantly, in that game, he had a 21% target share. Tennessee's a top half matchup for tight ends, so if that share continues on, he should be good. But I do think last week's matchup against Detroit played a role in his success. He's certainly not a locked-in, obvious start. The other guy in this tier, though, is Hunter Henry. Henry's seen at least a 13% target share in 3 of his last 4, and this week, he's got the dream matchup against Arizona. The Cardinals are the second best matchup for tight ends according to my adjusted fantasy points allowed metric, but they're very, very close to being the absolute best matchup. So the increased usage for Henry combined with this matchup makes him a good streaming choice. Now we're going to talk about players who are rostered in fewer than 10% of Yahoo leagues who could maybe find your lineup this week. But as usual, I hope you don't actually have to use these guys, or at least use most of them. But you never know. I like Nick Westbrook-Ikhine for all the reasons I talked about with Robert Woods. The difference is that Woods has more of a concrete role in that offense, but I would guess that Westbrook-Ikhine could see more looks in a plus matchup if Treylon Burks is out. I say that I like him, but I really think he's just okay given we're looking at players not rostered in many leagues. It's not sounding great for Courtland Sutton this week. Kendall Hinton would be next in line. And while I definitely do not find the Broncos' passing attack appetizing, they do get Kansas City. It's not only a game that could force a pass-heavy script, but the Chiefs are a top-half matchup for wide receivers. Hinton just 2 weeks ago had a 28% target share in this Denver offense. So it's possible that he comes through with a usable performance. In that same game and in that same offense is Mike Boone. Now in week 13, the Broncos didn't get hit with a negative game script. They had just 3 offensive plays while trailing. And Latavius Murray was their lead back, playing 68% of their offensive snaps. But according to Next Gen Stats, that 68% snap share for Murray, that dropped to 50% when the Broncos faced a 3rd and medium or a 3rd and long. Earlier this season, Mike Boone was often deployed as the team's pass-catching back. So in a game against Kansas City where the Broncos could very easily trail and trail big, maybe Boone gets some more run as a pass catcher. Considering week 13 was his first game back from injury, it's not surprising that he didn't just take his old role back right away. Now, I mentioned Daniel Bellinger on the 15 Transaction Show, and I don't mind him this week. He's still rostered in just 4% of leagues, but he's coming off a game where he ran the 3rd most routes for the Giants and he had an 18% target share. Philly ranks as a below-average matchup in adjusted fantasy points allowed to tight ends, but they're actually 11th in adjusted target share allowed, meaning teams are using their tight ends more in the passing game against the Eagles than they typically do. Without alternatives in that offense, I do like Bellinger. And then the final player in this tier is Chig Okonkwo from Tennessee. He's actually seen a 20% target share in 3 of his last 6 games. He's seen 5 targets in back-to-back games. Treylon Burks is banged up. And Jacksonville's not a horrible matchup. They're pretty average in adjusted fantasy points allowed. So I think Okonkwo makes sense as a deeper streamer. Now, as for the defensive streamers, I mentioned Pittsburgh earlier this week, and they're in play against a Ravens team starting a backup quarterback with a sub-17-point implied team total. There's also the Raiders against the Rams. LA is the 3rd best matchup in adjusted fantasy points allowed this year, and that was largely with Matthew Stafford under center. It's a great matchup for the Raiders. And then I don't mind Arizona against New England. You've got a struggling offense in the Patriots facing a team coming off a bye, and the Cardinals are at home. New England's been a little bit better at protecting their quarterback the last couple of weeks, but they've given up a top 10 sack rate this year, with the Cardinals being top 5 in pressure rate. That's it for today's show, though. Thanks to all of you for listening. If you yet subscribe to the Late Round Fantasy Football Podcast, make sure you are by searching for it pretty much anywhere podcasts can be found. You don't forget to follow me on Twitter, @LateRoundQB. Remember to check out LateRound.com. Otherwise, I'll talk to you tomorrow with the weekly mailbag show.